so happy we alive.
That the patient really is relieved of the pain or the nausea or whatever it is. They were concerned about giving enough of it. They did not worry about toxicity. Now, it seems to me that to impose the FDA protocol on marijuana, to give it this modern seal of approval, would be like doing the same thing for aspirin. Aspirin was synthesized in 1898, acetyl salicylic acid. It rapidly, because people could see, and we've had loads of experience, mind you, this was more than 60 years before the large double-blind control studies, the gold standard of the acceptance of medicines nowadays. We have an enormous amount of experience with aspirin, as we do with cannabis, and it is safe. Now, mind you, when I say safe, in parentheses, we lose about 1,000 to 2,000 patients every year to aspirin in this country. And yet that's considered a safe medicine. If you look at the NSAIDs, for example, about 100,000 people are NSAIDs, meaning non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, of which ibuprofen is an example. About 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people are hospitalized for complications with NSAIDs, and 10% of them lose their lives. Now, they are considered safe medicines. But the fact of the matter is, to go back to aspirin, if you tried to get it through the FDA approval process today, it couldn't be done, because the patent has long since expired, and nobody is going to put up the tremendous amount of money it would take to do this. Now, there are other reasons why marijuana is not likely to be to receive the FDA approval. One is today's anti-smoking climate, and I think the exaggeration of the harm, and again, I'm not saying that smoke is good for you, but I do think that living in any urban city in America is probably ultimately much more harmful to your lungs than having a cannabis joint once in a while. But in any event, I think the government is taking advantage of this anti-smoke, saying, oh, can't smoke this because it's so dangerous, get lung cancer and so forth. Well, you know, people have been smoking pretty regularly since the 60s. That's about 40 years. One would expect if there was going to be a blip in lung cancer and emphysema, we would certainly see it. Now we don't. And I think the major reason it's not likely to ever go through the FDA, aside from the economic reasons, is that there is a concern that it might be used for purposes which are disapproved of by the government, namely recreation and the kinds of uses that we will be talking about in the panel this afternoon. But just for a moment, imagine, and this will take a leap of imagination, imagine that it is approved, that is marijuana, the marijuana that some of you know about, and this is approved for medical use while it continues to be prohibited for other uses. It raises certain questions. How would labeled use be determined? By labeled use, I mean when a medicine is approved, it's approved for the treatment of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or whatever it is. Now, a physician can prescribe off-label, interestingly, for any other drug other than dronabinol. Dronabinol was the first drug that was ever approved where there was a caveat: you can't prescribe this off-label. Some of us ignored that, and wondered what the risk of ignoring it was, but nevertheless. But how would it be labeled? Is it likely that the government, which the FDA defines the labels, would it ever make, let's say, the treatment of dysmenorrhea something which many, many women find cannabis is very useful. Is it likely to say this is a labeled use of cannabis? I would doubt that. Or let's say something even more rare, even rarer, hiccups. Now, I just have a couple of anecdotal accounts on this, but they're very powerful. The most powerful being my own experience as one who once I had hiccups in medical school that went on for almost 72 hours, and none of the professors at Harvard, I was a second-year student, could figure out what to do with this. I hiccuped through the night. You couldn't sleep or eat or anything. I've had other. Well, then I discovered the sugar treatment from an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that mostly worked. But a few years ago, I discovered cannabis. Smoked cannabis and zinc, that's the end of it. And I thought, well, I'm not going to say anything about that. That's too far out. And then, of course, I came across a letter in a medical journal describing exactly the same thing by a physician who had a patient. So, let's say that as we collect more data, this is a treatment for intractable hiccups. Is it likely to be a labeled use for cannabis? Then there's the question of who would provide the cannabis. Now, you know, for the compassionate IND program, the government did from the farm in Mississippi, and they claimed that they would have trouble producing enough of it to support a research program that Rick Doblin and Ethan Russo were. One of the reasons they gave for turning that down, they couldn't provide the cannabis. In any event, the government isn't, by law, can't provide a medicine. If it's defined as a medicine, they can't do it. So what would they do? They'd contract this out to farmers? Would those farmers be required to have big security fences and security guards around their cannabis fields? What about how would it be distributed through pharmacies? How are pharmacies going to have it and keep fresh supplies? Are they going to have to get refrigerated safes? Would the price have to be controlled? After all, let's say if you know that cannabis is a medicine that's available at your pharmacy and it sells for such and such a price, and that's a lot less than it should be because, after all, it's a pharmaceutical. We've heard of Mike Corral's estimate, and other people come to about the same place in the estimate. That's a lot cheaper than what people pay for using it for other purposes on the street. Aren't doctors likely to be overwhelmed with people with fictitious illnesses who want cannabis as a treatment? If, on the other hand, the price is too high in the pharmacy, aren't people likely to go to the streets or to their own closets or gardens? Similarly, what about potency? The people who the 8 survivors who still have compassionate INDs say that the stuff is ditchweed, and you have to puff an awful lot. Talk about imposing a risk from smoking on people. Those people have to smoke an awful lot because the potency is so low. So you can imagine if people think, if it comes to be that the pharmaceutical grade of cannabis is pretty potent and you don't have to puff away at it, again, won't there be a lot of people who will go to their doctors and tell them about this backache that they have? What about urine tests? How can there be urine? We heard yesterday how wild corporate America is about urine tests, and some of the reasons why. That's not likely, given the enormous investment in that will disappear right away. How will General Motors distinguish between this worker who uses it because